We are being beautifully translated after listening to creative artists like Sri K. Satchidanandhan. We believe in Sudhit Mukherjee's definition of translation as transcreation or discovery. He carries towards nature through his poem മറന്നുവെച്ച വസ്തുക്കൾ. ഇപ്പോൾ തോന്നുന്നു ഈ ഭൂമി തന്നെ ദൈവം മറന്നു വെച്ചതാണ്. അതിൽ നമ്മളെയും ഓർമ്മ വരുന്നതിനനുസരിച്ച് അവൻ തിരിച്ചെടുക്കുന്നു. പുഴകളെ, കാടുകളെ, നമ്മളെയും. We empathetically listen to his lamentations through the poem വറ്റിയ പുഴയുടെ തോണിക്കാരൻ. വറ്റിയ പുഴയുടെ ഓർമ്മയിൽ ഞാനുണ്ട്, എൻ്റെ നീണ്ട പാട്ടും. വറ്റിയ പുഴയുടെ ഓർമ്മയിൽ ഒരു വാതിലുണ്ട്, അതിലൂടെ മുടിയഴിച്ചിട്ട് ചിരിച്ചു തിമിർത്ത് കടന്നു വരുന്ന നിളയും കാവേരിയും ഗംഗയുമുണ്ട്. The genuine poet explains the process of himself becoming a poet thus. കവിത എന്നിലേക്ക് വന്നത് എവിടെ നിന്നാണെന്ന് എനിക്ക് പറയാനാവില്ല. ഇതേക്കുറിച്ച് ഓർക്കുമ്പോഴൊക്കെ എൻ്റെ തട്ടിപ്പുറത്തെ അവിരാമമായ മഴയുടെ ഭിന്ന ശ്രുതികൾ കാതിലെത്തുന്നു. സ്വയം അദൃശ്യമായി നിന്ന് എങ്ങനെ ചലിപ്പിക്കുകയും ചെയ്യാമെന്ന് കാറ്റ് പറഞ്ഞു തന്നു. The theme of death is subtly presented through almost all his poems. He is never afraid of death, but as a poet, he is afraid of an indifferent, painful world. ആത്മാവ് സംസാരം നിർത്തുകയും മനുഷ്യന് ഇലകളുടെയും വെള്ളച്ചാട്ടങ്ങളുടെയും ഭാഷ മനസ്സിലാകാതാവുകയും ചെയ്യുന്ന ലോകത്തിന്റെ ശ്വാസം മുട്ടിക്കുന്ന മൗനത്തെ മാത്രമേ ഞാൻ ഭയപ്പെടുന്നുള്ളൂ. So sir, we are going to cherish all these moments for our future life. As the head of the department, I am so much pleased to have the presence of the magnetic, vibrant principal, Dr. Matthew P. Joseph here, and of course the calm, handsome bursar of the college, Dr. Philippos is also here, and Dr. N.S. Sugadan is also another charismatic personality, adding to the color of the already colorful function. And I am already on the verge of tears to see my sister-like friend Dr. Alice in front of me, with the late friend Dr. Raji, along with his friend the master Jayaprakash Vijayan Mash is here. Then Jinu, the young poet, campusile യുവകവിയാണ്. മഴ ക്യാമ്പസിൽ പെയ്യുമ്പോഴൊക്കെ തന്നെ യുവകവിയായിട്ടുള്ള ജിനുവിനെ ഇപ്പോഴും ഞാൻ ഓർക്കാറുണ്ട്. ഈ മഴ എന്തിനാണ് എന്നെ ഇങ്ങനെ നനച്ചു പൊള്ളിക്കുന്നത് എന്ന് കവിതയിലൂടെ വിലപിച്ച ജിനു വളരെ സുന്ദരമായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു പ്രസൻസ് ആണ് നമ്മളുടെ ഇടയിൽ. We are delighted to have members of the faculty from other department, from the physical education department, from the Malayalam department, of course, Satchidanandhan, very close department, very closely situated to the Department of English. Then all the other friends, dear students, we love you all for your effort. I would like to congratulate the faculty coordinators, Steve Vincent, Divya Udu, and Rijo John, and again Gigi and Jacob for their efforts. We would also like to congratulate the student coordinators of the program, Kessia, Bijol, then George P. Matthew and Mary Peter. Wish you all very delightful time here. Thank you. Thank you.
While translation has always been an area of ambiguity, of debate and discussion, and in that sense semi-lit, half-lit. And again, as you know, translation has had and still has several definitions, several approaches, and there's a whole world of translation theory out there into which I do not even dare enter at this moment, because that is an absolutely different area of understanding, of interpretation, of the continuous travel between one language and another. Well, I have been reading a lot of theories of translation because for some time I headed a department of translation in the Indira Gandhi Open University in Delhi. But I am not bringing all those theories into play in my brief talk, which is not, I promise you, a lecture, not certainly as long as the kind of lecture I gave earlier in the Department of Malayalam. Because I had already opted for an interactive session rather than a single lecture, because lectures are monologues, and monologues always involve power. It is like somebody continually talking, and a situation where the listeners have very little chance to ask questions and to interact. So I would like to develop a dialogue here, and I would just make a few initial remarks on translation based on experience, which of course is naturally illuminated a little by translation theories, even though, as I said, I am not going into the subtleties and nuances of the theories of translation. So that I may provoke a discussion, maybe I'll just put forward a few points. Well, you have named it as a talk being done in the global cultural context, but I would rather make it narrower, make the realm narrower, by pointing chiefly to the Indian translation theories or the Indian approach to translation, which certainly has its place in the global context. I would speak a bit about the Indian attitude to translation, a bit about the politics of translation, and maybe a little about my own experience of translation and what exactly it has done to me and it has done to my poetry and my understanding of the horizons of translation in general. I would like to begin with a story which in some sense has some bearing on translation. A story with which some of you may already be familiar. This is a story, a folk tale in fact, retold by A.K. Ramanujan, whose name I'm sure you know very well, because he is easily one of the greatest poets in English who ever lived in India. He was a great professor of English and of Indian literature, who worked in the University of Chicago for several years. And he is also, as you very well know, one of the greatest translators of our time in India. A translator both of modern poetry, he translated some of my poems also, and also a translator of ancient Tamil poetry and ancient Kannada poetry, especially Bhakti poetry. I'm sure you have gone through many of his translated works, like Speaking of Shiva or Hymns for the Drowning. Several books which have been brought out by Penguin, which is, I think, an essential part of education for any Indian, whether you are learning English or learning Malayalam or learning Indian literature in general. I believe these are some of the essential books that one must go through. While also you should go through the essays of A.K. Ramanujan, which have being collected now, because now it is easy to access these books, because Penguin has brought out a collection of a big collection of A.K. Ramanujan's essays, and an equally big collection of A.K. Ramanujan's poems, and a third collection of A.K. Ramanujan's translations. And if you have these three books, well, you have a kind of access to that great world that Ramanujan created. So it was, of course, I casually spoke about Ramanujan, but I was just going to cite a folktale that he has written. You know, he was also a master of folktale. He has a collection of Kannada folktales, Indian folktales actually, which he collected and he translated into English. That was another area of his study, because he constantly traveled between what he called the great tradition and the little tradition. By the great tradition, he meant the Indian classical tradition, which is not only Sanskrit tradition, as sometimes it is presented, but in fact it is also the great Tamil tradition, the great Sanskrit tradition, of course, the great Pali and Prakrit tradition. All these are part of the great Indian classical tradition, and what Ramanujan chose to call the great tradition. Traditions as being completely different from each other, being watertight compartments. Instead, he always spoke of the inevitable connections between the little tradition and the classical tradition. Maybe I am deviating, because that is another area of my study. This kind of a basic kinship between folk traditions and the classical tradition. How the folk has travelled into the classical tradition. How Brihat Katha or Brihat Katha Manjari or the tales of the Panchatantra, and many of these originated as folk tales, and later they were preserved in Sanskrit. So it is not as though these are completely different, as some theoreticians would make them out to be, but they have a very fundamental and organic connection between them. When I come to the story, it's not a long story, I will not go into the details of the story either, which I would take as a metaphor for translation. Ramanujan retells the story in his introduction to one of his most famous essays called 300 Ramayanas, which I'm sure most of you have read this essay, if not as an independent essay, in the anthology that Paula Richman has edited called 300 Ramayanas, and this is the opening essay of that anthology. And you know Paula Richman, who is a very intimate friend of mine, is a major scholar of Ramayana in the world now, in the world scene. Of course, we had Father Kamel Bulke, a Reverend Belgian priest, who was the first to write about the diversity of the Ramayana tradition in South Asia. You know, he has a book called Ram Katha. He wrote it in Hindi. He came to India, studied Hindi, and he wrote this book called Ram Katha about the different Ramayanas, especially in India and also in other South Asian countries. And in 300 Ramayanas, Ramanujan also speaks of the diversity of the Ramayana tradition. Of course, we have not 300, maybe more than 3,000 Ramayanas, but you can take it as a kind of metaphoric expression of the diversity of the Ramayana tradition. And there he comes to tell us the story about the end of Rama. Rama, the great king of Ayodhya at that time, was sitting in his court, heading his court. He had all the courtiers around him and all the advisors who were rishis or the saints of the time. And when he was there in his court, the ring on his index finger fell down and vanished through a small hole on the floor. The ring fell down and nobody could find exactly where it had disappeared. It just vanished through a hole on the floor, and it, of course I'll tell you later that, well, it reached the netherworld. which we called, sometimes it is called Atalam, and we also use the word Pathanam for it sometimes, even though there are some nuanced differences between the two. So Atalam means the world which is supposed to be under our world, unlike heaven which is supposed to be above our world. So the ring went to this netherworld, and only one person could perhaps bring it back. Who could it be? It could only be Hanuman, because Hanuman has this strange capacity, as you perhaps know, to grow as big as a mountain and to grow as small as a mosquito. So Rama obviously asked Hanuman, please go and get my ring back. So Hanuman became very small, like an insect, because he had to pass through that hole to retrieve the ring. And so he became very small. He went through the hole and he found that he had reached the netherworld. But there are other nuanced aspects of this story, because the cooks of the emperor of the netherworld found a small being falling down through a hole, and they knew that their emperor liked to have new kinds of meat for every dinner, and they thought that, well, he might like this little thing, this little being which had just come down and fallen. So they took Hanuman, without knowing that it was Hanuman, of course, took him and put him on the dinner platter, the dinner plate of the emperor of the netherworld. And then he heard somebody from the plate, or a being, an insect from the plate, chanting Ram, Ram, Ram. The emperor looked at that direction and asked that insect, who are you? Why are you taking the name of Ram? And then Hanuman told the whole story. Well, my master's ring fell down and it has come to this world, and I have been sent here as Ram's faithful messenger to retrieve the ring. And then the wonder happened, because then the emperor brought before Hanuman. Of course, Hanuman also introduced himself as Hanuman. He said, I am Hanuman, the messenger of Ram. And Hanuman was known both in heaven and in the netherworld. And so the emperor, with great reverence, took him to his room and offered him a huge plate full of rings. And he told Hanuman, well, if you can find out which is your Ram's ring, you can take it and take it back to Ram. But there have been so many Rams before, and there are going to be so many Rams in the time to come. And your Ram is only one of those thousands of Rams. And he also said, the ring of every Ram, the ring on the index finger of every one of these incarnations of Ram falls like this, and it comes to the netherworld when Ram is about to die. Of course, not die. Generally we say when they are about to attain salvation, when they attain moksha. And he told Hanuman, by the time you go back to your earth, you will not find your king there. He will have already entered river Sarayu and attained salvation, attained moksha. Hanuman went back and he found that, yes, the king of the netherworld had told him the truth. Ram had vanished, he was no more there, and now his children were ruling Ayodhya. Ramanathan tells this story. Of course, he tells the story in a particular context to tell us that Ramayana is not a single book or single text, but there are thousands of Ramayanas. I will not go into that tradition because that will be another lecture on Ramayana, which again is one of my very dear subjects. I have also tried to understand the Ramayana tradition, the different kinds of kinships in different Ramayanas, the Buddhist Ramayana, the Jain Ramayana, the Muslim Ramayana, the various tribal Ramayanas that we have. So there are There are thousands of Ramayanas in every South Asian country. I will not go into that because that is not exactly my topic. What I meant to say was that there are, in India itself, there are so many Ramayanas, as we very well know. In Malayalam, there are 29 Ramayanas, written and spoken Ramayanas, besides many, Atakathas and, Tullal Kathas and various other things, performance, the stories which are performed. And there are mural paintings, various kinds of Ramayanas. Are these, let us begin the question of translation from here. Are all these Ramayanas the translation of a single Ramayana? Or are they different texts? Because this is a question which is fundamental to an understanding of translation. For example, we have the most famous of Malayalam Ramayanas, which is Tunjathaduthachan's Adhyatma Ramayana, which is supposed to be a translation of another Ramayana, not Valmiki's Ramayana, but another Ramayana called Adhyatma Ramayana, which is part of an ancient Purana. But we have also, of course, a wonderful translation of Valmiki Ramayana by Vallathol Narayana Menon, our great poet. And we have several other Ramayanas. And recently, a Vayanadan Ramayana, tribal Ramayana has been published. A Mappila Ramayana has been published, which is written like a Mappila song. And we have several stories and novels based on Ramayana. Sarah Joseph has written a lot of stories based on the women characters of Ramayana. So we have a whole world of Ramayanas, right from Kannashans, the Ram Katha. Ramayanas began to be written when Malayalam was slowly finding its own identity, a different identity from Tamil. From those days, we have various kinds of Ramayanas. So can you consider all these Ramayanas translations of a single Ramayana? So when you look at them, we find that these are all different from one another. There are various kinds of differences. Sometimes the relationships are different. Sometimes, Ravan becomes even more important than Rama. This is particularly true of the Tamil Kamba Ramayana, because I have been there for 26 years. I have been living in Delhi, and I know that in the Ram Leela plays, which are staged every year in Delhi and in all North Indian cities, the best actor plays not Rama but Ravana. A great orator, a great speaker, and of course a great valiant fighter. So only a very good actor can play the role of Rama in all these different moods and incarnations. And so if you look at the Tamil Ramayana, Kamba Ramayana, a part of it has been translated in Malayalam by S.K. Nair. The Balagandam has been translated, and now Attu Ravi Verma is doing a complete translation. I pray God gives him a life long, because he is not well, a life long enough to complete his translation. He does a few slokas every day. And so, not slokas, verses, I should say, being in Tamil, a few verses every day. So there are all these. Let us only look at the Malayalam Ramayana. All these Ramayanas are, if you look closely, different from one another. Sometimes, if you look at the whole Ramayana tradition, there are Ramayanas where Sita is Ravan's daughter, Sita is Ravan's sister, and there are Ramayanas where there is no battle, which is supposed to be very central to Ramayana. Where in the Pili Ramayana, for example, of the Pili tribe, because they don't believe in wars, Ravan returns Sita to Rama and apologizes to him, and Rama blesses him, and that is the end of Ramayana. Well, that's the whole tradition. What I mean to say is, these are not exactly translations, but somebody, I think in the introduction, used the word transcreation, which might perhaps suit this. But also our idea, the Indian idea of translation, was different from the Western idea of translation. We looked at our translators not as translators, but as major poets, who actually established our literary languages. Like we consider Eഴുത്തച്ഛൻ to be the father of the Malayalam language itself. And so we look at these people not as translators, but as writers.
Who becomes very much fortunate in listening to his talk. And all the problems, in 1 hour time he had been discussing the problems regarding translation. He was telling us that every translation is different in its own way. I was reminded of Leo Tolstoy's talk, wording by Tolstoy. All happy families are alike. All unhappy families are unhappy in its own ways. All happy families are alike. All unhappy families are unhappy in its own ways. In the case of translation, as a person who writes and translates from different languages, so I was talking about Spanish, German, Japan, and other words in the morning session. It's because of his understanding, depth and drive in different literatures, he could talk like that. So anyway, our students, they are really becoming inspired by, sir, your very enthusing words altogether. നമ്മുടെ മലയാളത്തിൽ തന്നെ തകഴിയുടെ ചെമ്മീനിൽ നിന്ന് എൻ്റെ തങ്കക്കുടവ് എന്നുള്ള വാക്ക് ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. അത് മൈ ഗോൾഡ് പോട്ട് എന്നാണ് ട്രാൻസ്ലേഷൻ. അയ്യോ, മലയാളിക്ക് എൻ്റെ തങ്കക്കുടവ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നതും ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ മൈ എ പോട്ട് മെയ്ഡ് ഓഫ് ഗോൾഡ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നതും തങ്കക്കുടവ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് ദ ക്വിൻറ്റസെൻസ് മലയാളിയുടെ സന്തോഷത്തിൻ്റെ, സ്നേഹത്തിൻ്റെ, ഉൾപ്പുളകത്തിൻ്റെ എല്ലാ ആത്മാംശവും അന്തർലീനമായിരിക്കുന്ന ഒരു ശ്രേഷ്ഠമായ വാക്കാണ് എൻ്റെ തങ്കക്കുട. ഈ എൻ്റെ തങ്കക്കുടം എന്ന് പറയുന്ന മലയാളത്തിലെ ഭാഷയിൽ കിട്ടുന്ന അതിൻ്റെ ആ സുഖം, ആ സാന്ത്വനം, ആ സന്തോഷം, ആ സ്നേഹം, അതിൽ ഉജ്ജ്വലിപ്പിക്കുന്ന വികാരം ഒരു പക്ഷേ മൈ ഗോൾഡ് പോട്ട് എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റ് ചെയ്ത് കിട്ടിയെന്നിരിക്കുന്നില്ല. പക്ഷേ സാറിനെ പോലെയുള്ള ശ്രേഷ്ഠരായ ചിന്തകരെ ഏറ്റവും കൂടുതൽ അതിൻ്റെ വൊക്കാബുലറി, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ആ വൊക്കാബുലറിയിൽ ഏറ്റവും കൂടുതൽ പരതുന്നവരാണ് ഈ ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റേഴ്സ്. കാരണം ആ സഹൃദയന്, നല്ല വായനക്കാരന് ആ നല്ല കറക്റ്റ് വാക്കങ്ങോട്ട് കൊടുത്തിട്ട് ദ വേർഡ് ക്രിയേറ്റ്സ് ദ വേൾഡ്, ഒരു വലിയ ലോകത്തെ കൊടുക്കുക എന്നുള്ളതായ ഒരു ശ്രേഷ്ഠമായ ഉദ്യമമാണ് ട്രാൻസ്ലേഷനിൽ ഉള്ളത്. ഇപ്പോൾ നമ്മുടെ പല ടൈറ്റിലുകൾ, ഡിഫറെൻറ്റ് ടൈറ്റിൽസ് വി ഹാവ് ഫോർ ദി അലുമിനി അസോസിയേഷൻ. We have Carpe Diem, we have SVETA, we have, one title is given here today, and we take different words from different languages to understand. And when you go to all these cultures, interactions, we develop ourselves, we understand the world better. We mix, we live in a culture of cultures, and also we have a mixture of cultures. So in the midst of this culture of cultures and mixture of cultures, translation is an essentiality. That translation brings about challenges, goodness from other walks of life also. So it was a splendid, great, graceful opportunity for all of us to listen to his words. I congratulate the department for organizing this, and all the esteemed professors who have come from different parts to listen to his talk. I salute them all. I thank you very much. I conclude. Thank you very much.
Ships, there are various kinds of suppression happening in the country. Everyone who believes in freedom and fundamental right to stand up and to, because you are standing up for democracy. You are standing up when you do that. You are demanding that our constitutional nobody can take these rights away from us. So we need to protest. I have been protesting at Quest Forum in Delhi, where there are so many Indian writers, and even in the case of Harish, we have come out with resistance against all these different kinds of violence. These are actually from so many. An artist like Emma Hussein, who made Indian modern art popular across the world there. And there is nothing sadder than that. And so it is I think it is the fundamental duty of all of us as Indian citizens. In machine translation. But my own experience tells me that machine translations can be a great extent, not fully even there. But I do not think, at least so far, and I do not think even in the future, machine translation can replace human beings when it comes to literary translation. Because the machines understand, because it is a machine, and so its understanding is also mechanical. So it will translate word to word. You must have used Google translations, and all the nuances are lost, or the deeper meanings are lost, and the order of words also completely changes, and so it becomes a very literary translation. Well, you can use it, for example, to create a first draft. You can create a first draft to have some understanding, but then you will have to work very hard on that draft in order to turn it into a real work of literature. So it can never.
Does it mean that Sturmers and disabilities are poetic in nature, or are you trying to say that Sturmer is some other figure of poetry? Disabilities are poetic in nature, or are you trying to say that Sturmer is the other figure of poetry?
Stammer. Yeah, the pulse. Stammer.
Yeah. Well, I have seen so many stammers like poetry, because I believe that poetry is an attempt to express something completely, but we poets are never successful in expressing what we want to express in the way we want to express it. Well, we go on revising, looking at the poem again, changing words, making many drafts. But even then, there is something that remains in you. I mean, the original that you had in mind, or the original that you had in your imagination. And it is very hard for even the greatest and the finest of poets to bring all that into language. Because there is a gap between thought and language, or there is a gap between the imagination and language, and this gap cannot completely be filled, because when you are trying to translate a dream into reality, also it happens. This happens when you try to translate an ideology into reality. There again you find that it is never translated in full. There are problems, and that is where I bring in this metaphor of stammer, saying that we stammer like poetry. Poets also stammer when they try to express things. You can never express something completely. There is no complete. Even language is inadequate to express the complexities of our imagination and our thinking completely. That's what I try to say in those particular lines when I speak about it. But of course, I say so many other things there. I speak about a nation stammering. Like we are stammering now. When stammer becomes their mother tongue, the whole people stammer. You are not sure about the meaning of what is being said by a leader. For example, you find that it is very hard, and you find a lot of people actually stammering. I mean, in the sense they are not able to say what they want to say, or they are not bold enough to say what they say, because they are afraid that a silence which is filled with sorrow, but sadly a silence.
Wordsworth terms a spontaneous overflow of emotions, recollecting triangularity. I'm asking you, how does this stammer, means the silence, stop the spontaneous flow of poetry?
What we are speaking about when we speak about stammer, because stammer stops the flow. It, Wordsworth, of course, did define poetry as a spontaneous overflow of feelings. He also spoke of it as, emotion recollected in tranquility. And sometimes I have found a contradiction between the two. Because if it is spontaneous overflow of feelings, how can it be a kind of tranquil recollection? Because in a tranquil recollection, very often this spontaneity becomes compromised. Well, I'm not going into that. This is a question I have asked in many vivas, and I have been asked also in my MA viva, and then I said yes, I find a contradiction there. So definitely poetry, okay, you can define it in your own way, but in all those spontaneous overflows, there are also certain standards. Like you come across, say, a bamboo, or some kind of an obstacle, or a stone in the flow of a river. It is stopped for a while, or it has to go around that rock, or go around that tree in order to flow forward. And these kinds of obstacles, even if you want to define poetry as spontaneous overflow, which I may not, then you have to accept that this spontaneous overflow, even because river is also a kind of natural flow, even that has obstacles, and so poet also has obstacles, because he or she may not be able to find the proper word for expressing what he or she actually feels or dreams about. So the stammer yes, stops the flow of poetry for a while, but still you go on flowing, you go on writing, despite these moments of hesitation, moments of interruption.
I'm a D1 student. You are a person who travels along various areas of writing such as poetry, criticism, translation, etc. After these, can you mention which one made you more enjoyable and more comfortable? Criticism or translation gave you more enjoy and more comfortable?
Translation as a secondary activity, as I very well said. Writing a poem is an extremely painful and extremely exciting activity. Painful because, as I said, you are not sure which word will actually express me completely. So there is pain, there is anxiety when you write. At the same time, finally when you get that particular word, or when you get a line correct, and when you feel that you have conveyed what you really want to convey, it also gives you an absolute pleasure, an absolute kind of satisfaction. In translation, as I said, because there are many other possibilities of translation, and so even when you begin, you know that I am doing only one of those possible translations, and so that may not give me so much of joy. It does give me joy, but I will not equate it with the kind of joy I get when I actually write a poem on my own.
The conclusion of interactive session of SLOVO SVETA. Our department is obviously proud to have development.
Honor that I stand before all to deliver the vote of thanks. A literary stalwart who directed the landscape of Malayalam literature to a new direction. On behalf of the department and the student community, I thank you, Sri Satchidanandhan, for honoring us with your presence, for taking time from your busy schedule to interact with us. Thank you, sir.